Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's TEENtastic Tuesday program. We have a terrific program in store today. I'm Madeline Bryant. I'm the Principal Librarian of Youth Services here at LAPL. And with me is Acting Senior Librarian and YA Librarian Extraordinaire, Lauren Spector. And we are here to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month and also to welcome and celebrate author Sarah Kuhn, whose new book just came out 2 weeks ago today, May 11th. And so we're going to talk to her and celebrate the book, which is From Little Tokyo with Love. A little bit about Sarah. She's the author of the popular Heroine Complex novels, a series starring Asian American superheroines. And the first book was a Locus bestseller, an RT Reviewer's Choice Award nominee, and one of the Barnes & Noble Sci-Fi and Fantasy Blog's best books of 2016. Her YA debut, the beloved Japan set romantic comedy, I Love You So Mochi, is a Junior Library Guild selection and a nominee for YALSA's Best Fiction for Young Adults. She's also penned a variety of short fiction and comics, including the critically acclaimed graphic novel Shadow of the Batgirl for DC Comics and the Star Wars audiobook original, Doctor Aphra. So her newest novel, like I said, From Little Tokyo with Love, came out 2 weeks ago. And I'd like to welcome Sarah, who is a third-generation Japanese American, lives right here in Los Angeles, wrote part of this book at Central Library. And welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So we have a series of questions to sort of ask you today, but this is a casual conversation, and we also might take some questions from viewers. So anyone out there who's watching, feel free. You can put those questions in the chat if you have a question for Sarah. But to start us off, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your newest book, and perhaps even read a passage from it for us?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we learned a lot about me, hopefully, in the introduction. But yes, I write books. I write comic books. Usually, they are either about Asian American superheroines or nerds in love. Sometimes they're about both. Shadow the Batgirl is actually also set mostly at a library, which I did not, I don't think I quite realized at the time was a very mean thing to do to my artist, Nicole Gu, because she had to draw a lot of books over and over and over again. And yeah, I've basically been apologizing to her for that for 2 years now. But it's always fun to be able to spotlight a location I love. And I do love libraries very much. I did write some of Little Tokyo in a library. And as far as the book goes, I've been saying, you know, it's like a modern fairy tale. It stars a half Japanese heroine. She's very grouchy. Her name is Rika. She lives in Little Tokyo, which is one of Los Angeles's historic, beautiful, magical neighborhoods. It is a very Asian American neighborhood. It is a very Japanese American neighborhood. And so she has grown up there. She is a tragic orphan, or at least that's what she thinks in the beginning. And she does not believe in fairy tales or happy endings or rom-coms or any of that stuff. And I guess, spoiler alert, some things happen that might change her mind. And so I was actually going to read a passage that features the LA Central Public Library. It was also written in the LA Central Public Library. And to kind of set it up a little bit, so Rika develops this weird connection with a famous rom-com star named Grace. She is also Japanese American, and Rika comes to believe, for reasons, that possibly this movie star, this Japanese American movie star, is her long lost mother, who she thought was dead all these years. And then she starts to kind of get this series of clues that takes her all over LA, all over Little Tokyo, to the library, as she tries to kind of unfurl this mystery. And she's helped on her quest by another actor named Henry Chen. And so in this scene, they have received a possible clue that there might be something they have to check out in the library. It's very mysterious. The only kind of hint they have about where they're supposed to go is this photo of some tile art that's in the library. And Rika, because she is a proud Angelino, she knows exactly where it is. So she's going to kind of show him, and they're going to figure out if this clue can help them unravel this mystery. So I was going to read a little piece from that. And this is, a unique piece that I'm really only reading for this event because it is so specific to the library. I'm pretty sure I know the exact tile art in Grace's photo. If you zoomed out, you would see a marvel of blues and greens forming the image of a wildly growing plant. There's a striking blue vase at the plant's base, but it can't contain all the curving leaves or the bright yellow flowers sprouting from the viney tips. It's a vivid portrait of life contained in a small space in this series of tiles. Every inch of the Los Angeles Central Library is crammed with these beautiful details. It is absolutely packed to the brim with hidden and not so hidden art. And I know all the corners of the place, each of its nooks and crannies, thanks to my addiction to gigantic Japanese folklore tomes. I still check them out by the stack. I'm on a mission to get the tile art from the photo, striding into the building with purpose. But before I can complete my mission, Henry grabs my arm. Hey, he gestures to the library gift shop. You want to get a baseball cap or something? I stop in my tracks, crossing my arms over my chest and cocking my head at him. Why? I live here. I don't need a souvenir of our visit. Is my hair too... I brush away a reddish tendril that keeps flying in my face. The glints of red in my hair get especially bright and brassy in the summer, and I've always been self-conscious about that. I tried to dye my hair straight black when I was younger, but that annoying red always pokes through somehow. Maybe it's offending his precious celebrity eyes. No, he says quickly. I like it. What? But before we can linger on whatever that was, he barrels on. He hesitates, his eyes returning to the gift shop. There's something going on under all that breezy confidence again. Like there's a thing he wants to say, but he knows saying it will make him sound like a mega douche. Sometimes, he pauses again, then gives a little shrug, as if to reclaim some of his bravado. When people recognize me, they take photos or post on social media, and I can't help but laugh. Are you serious? You're worried about getting recognized at the library? He gives me a smile that's a tad too close to a smirk. You'd be surprised. Anyway, I'm not so much worried for myself as I am for you. All the photos and stuff are particularly intense when I'm out with a person. Hence the camouflage. He taps the brim of his own baseball cap. I don't need camouflage, I say, rolling my eyes and sweeping a hand through the air. I'm not famous, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself should we meet. I lower my voice, make it extra dramatic. You're public. Fine, he says, his smirk widening. Whatever oddness was lurking underneath that easy confidence has vanished now. Maybe it was never there in the first place. So where are these tiles? I lead him to the escalator, and we go up to the second level. I'll admit I kind of take him the long way, making sure we go through the crown jewel of the building, the rotunda. I'm gratified when he stops for a moment in that glorious, airy, open space, craning his neck to drink in the beauty that's all around him. Whoa, he says softly, taking in the impossibly high curving ceiling, the endless tiled murals that cover the walls. Even the floor is a sea of marbled tiles. My favorite part, though, is the fixture that hangs from the very center of the ceiling, a globe encircled by a ribbon of lights. It looks like absolute magic, suspended midair. And somehow this beautiful space is always perfectly quiet, even though the library's status as a very historical, very beautiful building makes it a prime tourist attraction. Today, there are 3 different tour groups, murmuring among themselves, being walked around the rotunda by enthusiastic guides. I gaze at the lit-up globe and feel the quiet and the sheer bigness of the place deep in my bones. When I'm tired of being in the real world, when the shadows of little Tokyo aren't enough, I know I can come here and feel utterly transported.
Thank you.
I love that. It's such a beautiful description of Central Library. And I have to admit, I don't work at Central and I don't get to be there as often as other people. So I'm like, oh, I can't wait now next time I go to like find this tile, like to look for those flowers very specifically.
Yes. So much beautiful art in the library.
Yeah. But speaking of Central Library in LA, From Little Tokyo with Love, it's obviously a romance between your characters, but it also reads like a love letter to the city of Los Angeles, and especially to Little Tokyo. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you love about LA and why you thought it was so important to include LA as almost a character in the book.
Yes, thank you. I love that question. I do love LA. I am a huge fan. I've lived here for a while, and I actually grew up in a kind of small town Oregon. It was not very diverse, and I still love my home state, but it was definitely a lot different than where I live now, and I had sort of kind of like made my way further south as I got older. So I went to college in the Bay Area, and then I moved down here. I think, wow, it's been I'm trying to remember how long it's been. It's been a really long time. I consider myself definitely an Angelino now, like Rika. I consider this my home. And, I think that LA, as it is portrayed in media, does not always have the best reputation. We get kind of a bad rap. There are a lot of, I think, misconceptions about what LA is. And I definitely wanted to write about LA in the way that it feels like sometimes people write about other cities like New York or Chicago, or, places that have felt like they have been very romanticized, very kind of, written about in this very kind of magical, loving way. And I remembered a book from when I was younger, the We See Bat series, by Francesca Lia Black. And I remember that those books always kind of gave me this feeling that LA was magical. It was like a fairy tale. It was, it had all of these sort of wonderful things in it. And that was, long before I had even been to LA or lived in LA. And so I think those books kind of informed my vision of what LA was. And as I've lived here, I've just, grown to love it even more. And I think, something that's really beautiful about LA is I feel like you can actually get just about anything, except maybe snow. You might have to go a little farther for that. But, we have every kind of nature. You might have to drive a little bit to find it, but we have mountains, we have desert, we have beach, we have, all these different kinds of beautiful nature. We have wonderful neighborhoods. I think there is this misconception that there are no actual neighborhoods in LA, but there are. And a lot of them are very, have like a lot of historical significance, have their own personalities, have their own kind of ways of doing things. I also think that's very interesting and very cool, because you can go from one neighborhood to another and it can kind of give you a completely different feeling. It's almost going on a little vacation, but it's not that far from your house. I also feel like we have every good kind of food. I have lived in places before where maybe that wasn't the case, or you had to drive 2 hours just to get something you were craving. And I feel like here it's pretty accessible. You can get just about anything you want. And finally, I feel like our population is very diverse. This is one of the few places where I can live, where I don't necessarily feel out of place. I really feel like I belong. And I feel that certainly extra in Little Tokyo. I feel like that place is, even though I don't live there, has that kind of home feeling. And, I think that's really beautiful. I think the fact that we have that diversity, and the fact that we also have this very vibrant art community, you know, that comes from so many entertainment industries being based here. You know, I feel like that is something that I maybe didn't know that I needed all of my life, but that I really did. And that has certainly been a big part of, you know, me coming into Little Tokyo in the first place. It was really that local Asian arts community that kind of welcomed me into that space. And so I just think, you know, there is something about LA that's magical, and I wanted to get that on the page, and I wanted the main character to also be kind of a proponent of that, I guess, like a supporter of that. And so, you know, she kind of has this, it's not really a rivalry, but she bickers a lot with Henry, who's her love interest, because he's kind of the classic New Yorker where he doesn't think that LA has any culture or like anything cool, or he doesn't think that people walk anywhere. And so I wanted to kind of like include some of that just to show that, like, as Angelinos, like, we are just as passionate about talking about our home and defending our home, and perhaps putting some somewhat more flattering portrayals of it out there.
Yeah, I love that Henry, you know, he appreciated all the spots that she took him to, and like really connected, and like, I think you did capture the magic, like especially the description of the old zoo too, which I just discovered like in detail, just, you know, during the pandemic, getting out and hiking, and like, I knew it was back there and I'd seen it, but I never really explored.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, that's another just really like weird, cool location that I feel like not everyone might know about. You know, I have joked with friends, with other, you know, LA writer friends, that a lot of times when they show LA in movies or TV, they use kind of the same three like stock, you know, video, like B-roll images, where it's like the Paramount lot, Beverly Hills, Rodeo Drive. Like sometimes they show, like back, especially when like Melrose Place was really big, I felt like they always showed the Melrose Place sign. And then sometimes it's like Disneyland, which isn't even in LA really. So, you know, I felt like, as with anything, and I did have Rika kind of talk about this in the book, it feels very flattening sometimes. It's like, okay, you're showing kind of the surface of what people think this is. But if you, like with anything, if you look at it a little deeper, there's a lot more to it. And I think that if you get someone like Rika to show you around, someone who has that deep love of LA and maybe has some really special favorite spots, they can give you like a little bit of a better, you know, a fuller picture of what the city is like, what the whole area is like.
Absolutely. Another reason why I was so glad we actually highlighted your book during this month, Mental Health Awareness Month, is that both Henry and Rika experience a lot of emotions, and Henry has anxiety and panic attacks, and Rika, of course, has her anger, right, that rises up again and again throughout the book. Why was that important to make that a part of Rika's character, especially the anger? But how did you decide to make that like an integral part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, like, especially talking about things like, you know, mental health and particularly in Asian American communities, how those things are kind of positioned. You know, I thought that was kind of important to show, in order to show, again, like the fullness of something, right? The nuance of something, the specificity. You know, I also have anxiety like Henry. And I think there is still kind of a stigma in Asian American communities about talking about mental health. You know, I was certainly raised with the idea that it is better to conceal, don't feel. It's better to kind of shove those things down. It's better to just, you know, sort of like get over things or act like they don't bother you. And I think, especially when your community has been through a lot. I mean, I was kind of coming at this from a place of like, well, my grandparents and my older relatives were all in the incarceration camps, like during World War II. I don't know if I really have anything to complain about. Like, I feel like maybe that, I was kind of like, well, that, it doesn't really seem like a big deal if I have a panic attack when I'm comparing it to that, right? But I think that because of that mindset, we then do not pay attention to things that we actually do need to pay attention to. We do not take things maybe as seriously as we should. And when I wrote my debut, Heroine Complex, I had written this character who, in retrospect, very obviously has anxiety, very obviously has panic attacks, very obviously is going through a lot of those things. But in that book, it is never named because I didn't know what that was. I didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know anxiety was a disorder you could have and not just like, oh, I feel, nervous about something. And when that book came out, I had started therapy finally very seriously. And I got all these emails and comments where people were like, wow, this is a really interesting, genuine portrayal of anxiety. And I was kind of like, I actually didn't realize that's what it was, but I'm glad that it wasn't, I didn't accidentally write something that was harmful or, ignorant or just by accident. So I kind of have taken that a lot to heart. And I did want to show, with Henry that like, this is something that still has a stigma. There are actually reasons for that, that he feels like his parents have certainly been through so much that he's kind of and sacrificed so much for him so that he can have this career as doing something creative as an actor, that he's kind of like, I don't really feel like I have anything to complain about, even when it is obviously affecting him very much. So I wanted to show that with him, that like, this is a thing. This is something that needs to be talked about more, especially in our communities. And this is also not something that is just cured, right? Like, it's not something you just get over. There are ways to seek treatment for it. There are ways to seek help. There are ways to process and move through your life, but it's not something where you just find this magic here and suddenly, you don't have panic attacks anymore. So that was certainly important, I thought, to show, someone in the Asian American community kind of dealing with this and how he dealt with it and how he sort of was able to find support for it from some of his peers. And then with Rika, it's funny because like, I think that's one of the things people have brought up the most reading this book is the anger, the fact that she is, I guess, allowed to have that, and that it's not kind of something that is positioned as bad, especially as she sort of figures out where it's coming from. And, one thing I've said a lot when I'm talking about this book is when I first started writing it, I did not think that was the arc. I thought it was about her learning to control it. I did think it was something that was negative or bad, or that, it was something that she really needed to get a handle on so she could sort of move through her life. And when I got to the end of the first draft, I was like, I actually don't think that's what it is. I think this was me almost, writing myself this really, really, really long letter, just saying this feeling, this anger that you have so much, that you certainly had when you were younger, is not bad. It is not an inherently bad thing. It is something that can power you. It is something that you can be empowered by. It is sometimes necessary. It is sometimes protection. It is sometimes, telling you that you are not being treated well, or that someone has kind of messed up, or that you need to protect someone. There's a lot of things that are within that emotion that are not bad. And, particularly for women, particularly for women of color, I think anger is something that a lot of times is coded as bad. I have certainly, throughout my life felt like sometimes I am maybe seen a certain way. Sometimes if I say something or try to push back against something in the most mild, gentle manner, it is seen as aggressive, or, wow, you're so emotional. Wow, you're really out of control. Wow, you feel really strongly about that. Wow, you're so angry. And what I have kind of come to is, first of all, I actually am still holding back. If you think this is aggressive, you would be very surprised if I actually let the full force of that come out. But I think like the other thing, which is something I feel like I was learning alongside Rika, is also that you kind of have to learn a little bit about your anger. You have to sort of learn, like, first of all, teach yourself that it's not bad, but you also kind of have to learn, and, you know, this is something I am still very much working on, how to not let it hurt only you, how to not let it be something that is just, like burning you up inside, like making you upset all the time, wasting all of this energy that you could be channeling in another way. And so I wanted both me and Rika to kind of learn that, like, yes, you absolutely need this emotion. This emotion is very important. It's very powerful. It's something that moves you forward and helps you kind of fight against things that are wrong. But you also need to figure out how to effectively channel that so it's not just hurting you. Which is something that I think can happen a lot. So, as I said, for me, that's still a work in progress. I'm still learning how to do that. But I think that is certainly a message that I would like girls reading this, especially girls of color, to kind of take to heart, that your anger is not bad. It doesn't mean you're a monster. It doesn't mean you're a terrible person. Even if you are getting some really horrible reactions from people observing your anger, it is still something that is, powerful and that can be good.
Yeah, and Rika's anger is valid. I mean, there are valid reasons why she is angry. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you mentioned at the beginning about like identity and belonging, which is a huge theme throughout the book. I mean, and that's a big reason why Rika has so much anger is that because she's biracial and living in Little Tokyo, she definitely feels like an outsider. And I sort of love her journey of trying to deal with her anger and also trying to deal with not feeling like an outsider, like learning that people love her for who she is and not, don't dislike her because of what she isn't. And I'm just sort of, I'd like to hear from you, because I think the whole book has so many like just wonderful conversations about identity and belonging. And I know you sort of covered this a little bit, but like, what is it that you hope that readers will kind of take away from all those discussions?
I think I kind of wanted people to know that everybody feels like that at some point. I have talked a little bit when I've been talking about this book about how she, like Rika, she feels like an outcast, not just because she's biracial in a Japanese American community, but also because she is, this tragic orphan. Like her presence, people kind of think of as scandalous. Like she is very angry, so she's always kind of getting into these situations where she expresses that in a way that maybe doesn't go over very well. And I think there are a lot of things that are contributing to her feeling that way. And, those were certainly all things I had kind of taken from my own life, except, that she's good at martial arts. I'm not good at any sports. That was kind of like a fantasy on my part that I could be good at like some kind of martial art or something. I think like I grew up in a really small, really white town. I did not have a lot of access to Asian American communities outside of my own family. And then as I kind of moved to, areas that were more diverse, like places where there was maybe more access to that, that was something I was really just overjoyed to find. A lot of the Asian American arts community here in LA is centered in Little Tokyo. I was very lucky to kind of be invited into that by friends I had made, and then was able to, make more friends the more I was there. And I think that that has been one of the most important things in my life, finding that community and seeing how we can all support each other, especially as artists of marginalized backgrounds who are trying to get that work out into the world. And so I think like as far as like the belonging part, there was certainly probably a part of me that felt like, you know, I didn't grow up with these communities outside of my family. Like, this is not something I maybe had access to before. I am biracial, so I sometimes felt like I didn't maybe look like what people's ideas were of like, this is a Japanese American person. And as I became more part of that community, especially fellow artists, I really learned that everyone at some point had felt like they didn't belong, you know, like whether it was because you are mixed race, whether it is because you are adopted, whether it is because you are just, you know, several generations in and you don't feel maybe as much connection to, you know, Japanese culture, Chinese culture, whatever it is. A lot of people felt like that for different reasons. And so I think that it's been very powerful for me to be able to come together with all of those folks and talk about that very honestly. And it has given all of us, I think, this point of connection that we maybe didn't know was a point of connection, you know, among these very specific experiences. And that's another reason why I you know, have a couple scenes of different groups of different kinds of Asian American people talking to each other. And for Rika, I kind of wanted her to realize, like, you know, especially as teenagers, I feel like we always feel like we're so alone, like our predicaments are so unique, like no one else can understand. And I wanted her to kind of see that like other people do understand, even if it's from a different perspective. Other people do know what she's going through, even if they don't have her specific experience, because that was certainly something I had found, you know, as someone coming into different communities like that. And so, yeah, I hope that especially I think Asian American girls can kind of see that and realize that, you know, the things that make us different are actually cool and things that we can talk about. And we can also talk about the sense of belonging or not belonging very openly, so that hopefully when we make those connections, we ultimately feel like we all kind of belong to each other. You know, we all kind of belong together as a community. And especially now when we are so physically separate, that's something that I think has been on my mind a lot. So yeah, it's a big part of the book.
So one thing that actually makes Rika sort of stand out is that from her cousins, sisters, who she grew up with as sisters, is that she does not believe in the fairy tales, the fairy tale ending. She wears a really awesome shirt and is very into Japanese folklore. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, about the Noriona, the yokai that Rika is kind of, she's obsessed with, and that's sort of her power.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, growing up, I was obsessed with rom-coms. Like, I was obsessed with fairy tales. Like, I was also obsessed with everything sci-fi fantasy, you know, superheroes and dragons and like everything like that. And so those were sort of these two formative parts of my personality that I was kind of trying to get on the page. I think with her sort of aversion to that sort of thing, what I was getting at, and hopefully this came through, was like, I didn't want it to be like, you know, oh, I'm not like other girls. Like I am allergic to that. I push it away with all of my strength. I do not like it. So I didn't want her to have that attitude, but I wanted her to feel like, you know, she's also kind of an outcast in her family, because all of her aunties and her cousins and like everyone is like obsessed with like these rom-coms and like princesses and Cinderella and all of these really sort of classic things that we think about. And I thought the sort of deeper level of that, of her kind of rejecting that, was not just that, you know, she's this like tiny badass who's always mad about everything. I thought it was, you know, that she has never seen herself in these stories? Not really, which is something that was also certainly taken from my own life. Like, it is a little bit different in this universe because there is a Japanese American movie star who stars in all the rom-coms. So there is perhaps a bit more of a visual example that girls, Asian American girls can connect to. But I thought with her, she would not really connect to any of that. And in fairy tales, in a lot of folklore that we are sort of more used to in our kind of westernized canon, like there is kind of this trope where a lot of times if someone is mixed race, if someone is biracial, they're automatically tragic. They're automatically the saddest person you could imagine. Sometimes that means they are a villain. Sometimes that means they're just so sad that they die for some reason. Like, there is sort of this assumption that if you are biracial, mixed race, multiracial, you can never actually be happy because you are so torn between these two different worlds. You don't fit in anywhere. Like, that's sort of like the trope that's been put out there, is the very tragic biracial person. And so I thought, even though she is very aware of her identity every day, this would be something she's probably seen a lot of, and we cannot help but internalize that. I have talked a lot in regards to all my work about how it took me so long to write Asian American heroines because I just didn't think someone like myself could be the Cinderella or the superhero or the girl at the end of the movie who's, wearing the big dress and like running down the beach. And, there is a scene in this where someone is wearing a big dress and running down the beach. So very intentional. But I just thought, like, she would feel like I am if you just describe who I am, I'm an orphan, like I've been raised by my family. My mom was this, pregnant teen who basically got exiled from Little Tokyo. Like, I stand out in a bad way in many different contexts. Like, I just thought she would never really see a possible fairy tale happy ending for someone like her. And I think sometimes when we push back against this, like, oh, I hate fairy tales, I hate happily ever after, I hate princesses, it's because of that. It's because we're sort of protecting ourselves, sort of wishing for that happy ending is a lot scarier. It's opening yourself up to being hurt. And so I thought, she would just kind of shut that down immediately and being like, well, I am not going to be hurt, so I am going to reject all of this immediately. And certainly as a Japanese American person, as someone who's, my mom and my grandma and my older relatives kind of really made sure I had this connection to that culture, to my culture. I had also heard some of these stories growing up that were like Japanese folk tales or fairy tales or mythology, where the ending was actually like not really that happy. Like, it was, maybe not outwardly tragic, but sometimes like a little muted or a little bittersweet, or sometimes it was like, no, this person, the monster just ate this person and that's it. And so I thought that was very interesting as well. And I thought that would be something that she would connect to more, especially since she kind of thinks of herself as this monster, as the Nuriona, who's like this half snake, half woman creature who's very scary and, is usually like eating terrible men. And, like, I thought that was just something she would connect to. And the thing I think that I was trying to get to by the end is that that's also not something she has to reject. Like, that is also something that is an important part of her, that she can still believe that, okay, I can have this happy ending now. I can be my own kind of princess. I can wear the big dress if I feel like it. Like, if I feel like that's something that I genuinely connect to, but also I do not have to kind of reject these other parts of myself. I do not have to make myself small. I don't have to get rid of my anger. I don't have to get rid of my love for this like monster snake woman. And, I just have to kind of incorporate all these things so that they make sense to me. And that's about letting more things in rather than rejecting something. So yeah, I wanted to make her a character who was, I wouldn't say an anti-princess, but is someone who is figuring out how to be her own kind of princess, which I think is what a lot of us are doing. You know, I loved all those Disney cartoons when I was growing up, but I never thought I could be Cinderella. You know, Cinderella was blonde and, you know, I and white, and, you know, it was just not something that was in my headspace. So I think I also want to kind of show girls who feel like they don't fit into any particular mold, whatever that mold is, that it's really okay to embrace every part of yourself, even if it doesn't look like what we think of as classic fairy tales. And as Rika points out, even a lot of the things we know as classic fairy tales originally actually had really terrible endings or really bloody endings. Or, you know, I still remember learning what the actual story of the Little Mermaid was as a child and being very traumatized. So, you know, I think like embracing that complexity in all things is something that I'm always trying to do.
Yeah. I love that part of the story. And I did love the dress scene on the beach.
Yeah, I have to admit that I sort of went down this Nura Ona like rabbit hole. I was like looking at all this stuff online, all these drawings and things, and it's pretty fascinating character. I mean, a lot of the Japanese folklore is so interesting. So I love that was incorporated into it. And like you said, like it's not like it's a bad thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
like
he's no Cinderella, but still.
He can embrace a lot of things. You know, I think I was especially fascinated by that because in I Love You So Mochi, which was my my YA debut, it's mostly set in Japan, and there is a scene where they go to something called Yokai Street, which was basically like is a real place and was kind of highlighting all the sort of monsters from Japanese mythology. And it's really cool. It's like there's art of different like monsters. There's like kind of tributes to different monsters. There's like a parade that happens where it's like all the people dressing up as yokai and stuff like that. So I just thought that was really cool. And I think that there's so many mythologies from around the world that a lot of us have personal connections to that maybe haven't been explored as much. So I always love that when I find books by like, especially, people of color, where they're kind of exploring that more, like connecting to that more, and maybe bringing it out to show like, we know kind of like the standard, whatever things that we learn about when we're younger that are sort of part of like the fabric of just, encountering different stories. But there are also all these stories from other places from around the world that a lot of us have grown up with that are actually really cool and that, I think deserve like a little bit more of the spotlight. So I wanted to include some of that as well, just that mythology that is maybe not as familiar to a lot of people unless you grew up learning about Japanese folktales.
The other thing I wanted to mention, and I have to say this before I know we'll go to some questions soon, but I truly wish that Katsu That was a real restaurant, because I would absolutely go there and try every katsu fried thing I possibly could. So I just had to mention that. But I did want to, Madeline mentioned this to me about, we love all of her aunties in the book and her cousins, but her Auntie Susie's closet. I have to ask about that because it sounds like an absolute dream. I love that she like sort of Rika sometimes hides in there and just wants to try on all the yukatas and all the other things, all the treasures in there. And Madeline had mentioned, do you have a closet like Auntie Susie's where you keep all your treasures and things?
I kind of do. It's not as organized as Auntie Susie's closet. Like, I feel like the way that I describe hers, it sounds like it's really like super organized. Like she definitely, went to the Container Store and watched the Home Edit and, Marie Kondo and all of that. And she like figured out how to organize all her stuff. And I also imagine it's almost like, because this book does have a little tinge of like contemporary magic. Like I sort of imagined that it was kind of a magic closet where it somehow fits in this really small apartment, but when you go into it, it seems endless. Like it seems sort of like a door to another world. Like it's so big, it's like somehow containing all of these things. Like that's sort of, and it's a place where, you know, Rika can go to hide. So that's kind of how I imagined it. My own closet is very disorganized. You know, I am a little bit of a clothes hoarder. Like I do love vintage. I do buy a lot of it. Before COVID, and I know this is like it's coming back a little bit. I loved, you know, the Pasadena, the Rose Bowl flea market, because I felt like I found like so many treasures there. When I go to a different city, like when I'm visiting somewhere, one of my favorite things is to find, you know, whatever the vintage stores are, the thrift stores, because I feel like depending on the region or the area, like it's always really different. Like you can find, you know, really cool stuff in different areas. I think one of my favorites was actually in Maui, where, you know, I love sort of bright prints, and like my style is kind of like Auntie Susie, where she's always doing the auntie thing. You know, she's print mixing and wearing a lot of bright colors and things that kind of shouldn't go together but somehow do. And in Hawaii, there was just so much like, you know, vintage like aloha shirts, like the long like dresses that are so beautiful, that there, you know, so many in circulation out there that are just in amazing condition. You know, they kind of have that like waterfall back, and they're always like these amazing colors. And so there's just like a lot of things like that I'm very interested in. And I thought it would be cool if, you know, I always like to make the adults in my YA books have kind of their own lives, like have their own interests, have their own passions, have that sense that their story is also still continuing. You know, they're also still proceeding on in life and hopefully having a good time. And so I wanted to, you know, show that as well for Auntie Susie and kind of give her, I guess, one of my interests. And certainly I also remember when I was younger, you know, my mom and a lot of my older relatives did have a lot of like kimono and, you know, very classic garments from Japan and things like that. And I just thought, you know, it would be cool if someone had a closet that was all kinds of vintage, you know, both kind of like the, you know, the very like Western dresses from the 50s that have like the big flared skirt and are always like, you know, that sort of perfect like cut. And then also things that were very Japanese, like kimono and yukata and obis and things like that. And I just thought that mix was another thing that felt very, very Asian American to me. So yeah, that was kind of taken from my life, but also I do wish, one, that my closet was magically endless, like was magically big enough to actually hold all of my clothes, and that I had organized it as well as Auntie Susie did.
Another magical thing in the book. I wanted to, ask you about your writing process. That always comes up, of course, when we talk to authors. But like, do you have any special things that you wear that are most comfortable when you write, or do you listen to music, or do you have do you write in the morning? Do you write in the evening? That kind of thing.
Well, of course, this has changed a lot in the past year and a half because, I used to really like to go out in the world to write. I felt like it was so vibrant, like it was a little easier for me to pay attention because there are so many distractions and ways to be lazy at home. That's part of why I loved writing in the library so much, is it's such a vibrant atmosphere. It feels, so you're really in LA, you're really experiencing LA. And of course that building is so beautiful. It's just kind of endless inspiration. So that's definitely been an adjustment to me because I feel like before I would have been like, I try to change my scenery. I try to be in places where there are people, where it feels alive in that way. And so, of course, haven't been able to really do that for a year and a half. I've just been here at home, had to use my imagination a lot. And I guess what works I mean, I think honestly, it changes all the time. You know, it's not even just like, oh, there's a pandemic, like I can't go anywhere. It changes every time. It feels like it's different for every book, and that's sort of been a work in progress as the world situation has continued. You know, there were days where I felt like I just can't even conceive of not wearing the same pajamas I've been wearing for the past few days. And there were days where like I was like, no, in order for me to feel really present, I need to like put on a real outfit. Like I need to like act like a human. I need to act like I am, you know, going out somewhere. But I think the other thing that has been, I guess, I don't know if it's a ritual, but it's definitely something that I don't think I could really write without, is that sense of community, you know. So I have Asian American communities, I have different arts communities, I have writing communities. And I feel very fortunate that I have several pretty active writing communities, writing circles, where I feel like even if it's not like a regular thing, like it's, you know, not maybe something that happens every day, there were at least, you know, text threads, Slack threads, like chats where I felt like, or even just like one-on-one people that I could text that I felt like sort of helped me just keep going. And I think that sometimes, like, especially now, it's really easy to get in your head, to feel isolated, to feel very alone. You know, writing books is by nature kind of a lonely thing anyway. I feel grateful to be able to still have those connections and to remember that there is an outside world and there are people who can commiserate with you. There are people who can support you through that, and hopefully you can do the same for them. And so I think, again, for me, it all comes back to having those communities and supporting each other and being able to kind of, you know, work through whatever we're working through together. And I feel, you know, extra special then when I see, you know, my writer friends that have really, we've supported each other this whole time, like buying the book or, you know, taking their picture with it or whatever, because they know everything that went, you know, probably more than anyone except my editor, like they know everything that went into making that. And then of course to try to do the same for them. So I think that is my biggest, I guess, hack or tip or whatever you want to call it, is just that ritual, is that I try to remember that having that community, accessing that community, like being present in that community is very, I think, important for my writing.
Yeah. I love to think of authors writing in a public space because you never know what people are doing, you know, that someone could be sitting down just writing the next best novel and you would never know it. I always picture authors very much like just huddled at home, right? And like it's great to think. So now when I walk around the library, I'm going to be looking for
I bet there are a lot of people who are writing, you know, books and screenplays and like other things, just because that space is so beautiful. There are a lot of places to sit. There are a lot of outlets, which is important for people with laptops.
Yeah.
And you know, it feels like a place where like it's quiet, but there's still that sense of life. There's still that sense of like, oh, there's like people around here always doing stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat, and if anybody else has any, please add them now because we are sort of running a little short on time. But Nicholas did ask, what are some of your favorite rom-coms? And I guess they could be movies or books. We'd love to hear both.
Okay, so that's my friend Nick Brandt, who is actually part of several of my writing communities. He's one of the people I was talking about who really has helped me through this past year and always. Thank you, Nick. And, you know, whenever someone asks me this question, though, I always forget like every movie I've seen and every book I've read and whether I even know what books are. But I see, like, I pull up my phone because I have started writing down the books that I read so that I can actually remember when I get this question. I think, like, especially in YA right now, there's a lot of great women of color authors who are writing these like wonderful, joyful stories starring women of color, which is like honestly basically what I want out of everything. And like some of my favorites are like Maureen Gu. Like she also writes like these beautiful LA set, or usually LA set, not always, but LA set rom-coms that I think have, in addition to the love between the two people, that obvious love of place, that love of the city. She really makes the city its own character. And I also love the way that she writes heroines, because I think her heroines are always very like, I guess like sassy, like they're always very forthright. They always kind of have these big personalities, which, you know, I think is another, like for me, like great thing to see in especially Asian American girl characters. I just love that. Another favorite is Gloria Chow. She also writes great rom-coms with Asian American protagonists. And I think she is really good at writing these books that are hilarious, like just make me laugh so hard, but they're also so poignant. Like she really gets into those sort of inter-community issues that we as Asian Americans have, like family expectations, like things that can make us feel pressure. But she does it in a way that these things that may, you know, you wouldn't think of as going together, this sort of hilarious comedy, and then this sort of more serious like deconstruction of, you know, what's happening in like Asian American society. Like I think she puts those things together really, really well. And I really love her writing. And let's see, what else have I read recently? I loved Happily Ever Afters by Elise Bryant. I think that is actually a great one to read if you are a big rom-com fan, because it is a little bit meta in that the main character is this girl who is writing, basically she's writing romance, she's writing like a romance novel, and is also kind of like obsessed with, you know, what happens in rom-coms, like how she can kind of make like her big rom-com moment happen. And so I love that book because I also think sometimes when you do something like that, that's maybe a little bit meta, or, you know, a little bit like of a big concept like that, it can occasionally feel, you know, distancing, like, oh, we are aware of this, so we're going to talk about it, we're going to sort of point it out in the text. And I felt like this book was still like so earnest, so heartfelt, so beautiful, that it was able to both kind of deconstruct the concept of rom-coms while also being a really good rom-com. And I think that's really hard to do. So those are, you know, I could probably go on forever just like with my list here of like women of color in YA writing, you know, girls of color in rom-coms. But that is something that I just absolutely love to see that. And I love to see kind of the variety of books that are coming out, the variety of authors that are telling these stories. So yeah, those are a few of my recent favorites as far as books.
Thank you. We do have another question. Anya wants to know, are there any other genres you want to explore in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to know, because sometimes I don't know what a thing is until I start working on it. But there are genres and markets and categories that I really enjoy that I haven't maybe written in yet. So, you know, I find that like a lot of times, sometimes in my downtime or like vacation time, I love reading thrillers. And I have never really written anything that's anywhere close to a thriller, but I love the way that a lot of those books unfold. Like the way that they're plotted is like so interesting to me and so masterful. Like it feels like you have to have such control of your kind of plotting craft, which I'm not sure if I really have yet. But that is, you know, maybe something I would like to try at some point. You know, I have talked a little bit about how I would like to write adult rom-com as well. You know, my heroine books are adult. They are romance in a way. They're also contemporary fantasy. So there's always, you know, all this other stuff happening that, you know, I would like to maybe write people in just a contemporary setting where there's no, you know, demons or superpowers or anything else like that happening. And yeah, I think the only one that seems sort of adjacent to me that I have been a little bit scared of, but that maybe someday I'll work up to trying, is like epic fantasy or high fantasy, where you sort of build this whole incredible world and this whole society and life's way of being. And I think that like one of the reasons I started writing contemporary fantasy was, one, I feel like my voice does not necessarily match that genre very well, does not necessarily match epic fantasy very well, even though I grew up reading it. I grew up, obsessed with a lot of it. The dragons again. But I feel like maybe there's something there I could try eventually. I think I feel like I need to level up a little bit before I do that. I have created like fake fantasies that are are in world, like part of my books, like in Heroine's Journey, which is the third Heroine Complex book. It's actually set mostly in a bookstore, which was the bookstore that was very obviously based on the Rip Bodice, which is the all romance bookstore here in LA, and had like a dog who was basically the bookstore dog. Like it was basically that store, but we called it something else. And the main character was like, she and her best friend are big like paranormal romance and like epic fantasy romance aficionados. So they're always talking about these books. So I had come up with this like fake book, basically, that I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like this lady who's like part dragon, and then she also is like a dragon slayer, or maybe her love interest was a dragon slayer, and then she was also like a scientist. Like it was like it was like the weirdest thing I could think of, basically, that still I thought would fit within what that would be. And all, like, so many people have asked me, like, is that a real book? Can I buy it somewhere? Like, it sounds so good. Like, oh, Bea and Leah in the book, they're so obsessed with it. And like, oh, it's not a real book, but you're kind of making me want to write it. So, maybe someday I'll write like a really like over the top dragon book. We'll just have to see.
Looking forward to it. Oh my goodness. I don't think there's enough dragon books. We are pretty much out of time. This has been just a really, really wonderful conversation with you, Sarah. I want to thank you so much. To everyone watching, please go ahead and check out her new book, From Little Tokyo with Love. And I want to put a plug in for the audiobook, because I actually listened to it on audio and it was really terrific. So,
oh, thank you. That's okay. So I have to mention that is read by Emily Wu Zeller, who is also a mixed race Asian lady. And she has actually recorded all of my audiobooks except for Mochi. And most recently, she was actually the voice of Doctor Aphra, who's the main character in the Star Wars audiobook that I wrote. And it was actually kind of funny, because she like that, Star Wars, like they didn't really ask me for my, like, who do you want to read it? Like, I just gave it to them, and then they were like, here's the cast. And so they were like, oh, yeah, the Aphra is going to be played by this girl, Emily Wu Zeller. Like, I don't know if you know her. And that same week, I had actually requested that she be the one they cast to read the Heroine Complex books, because they had sold those rights. They sent me like a few different narrators, and they were like, oh, can you like give us, like a couple options in case your first choice isn't available, or, in case something I was like, of course, I'm very professional. And then I listened to the samples, and I wrote back, and I was like, I'm sorry, but the only person who I feel like is actually so perfect is Emily Wu Zeller. Can you see if you can get her? And they were like, okay. And then they did. So that same week, I found out she was doing both of those things. And then when this book was getting ready to be done for audio, the producer at Penguin Random House was actually the same person who had produced the Aphra audiobook. So he was like, hey, do you think we need to look any further than Emily? And I was like, no, please get Emily for me. Thank you very much. And so this feels like the fact that she recorded this audiobook felt sort of like a culmination of all of our work together. And, I hope that she is able to record some of my books in the future. So I'm glad you enjoyed the audiobook, and I hope other people do as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead and put a hold on it. It is available in our catalog, everyone. And again, thank you so much. For everyone out there, we will have another TEENtastic Tuesday next week, which is already June 1st at 4:00. And we're going to be having a voguing workshop and learning all about ballroom with dancer Isla Ebony. So it's going to be it's kicking off all of our Pride Month programming. Can't believe next week's June 1st, but we'll be right here for another fantastic program at 4:00. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.